In the winter of AD 65, as Rome reeled from conspiracies, purges, and the tightening paranoia of Emperor Nero, a quiet tragedy unfolded behind the polished marble walls of the Palatine. It began not on a battlefield or in the Senate, but in the dim chambers where Nero's attendants whispered about a beautiful young slave whose fate would soon become inseparable from the emperor's unraveling mind. This was the moment Sporus entered history, not by choice, but through the will of a man whose absolute power blurred every boundary between desire, fear, and madness. At a time when Rome itself seemed perched on the edge of collapse, the life of one castrated boy would become a mirror reflecting the empire's moral decay. Sporus was born into a world in which a slave's identity could be reshaped by the demands of a master, but even in that brutal hierarchy, what awaited him was far from ordinary. Ancient sources never agree on his origins, but they do agree on one thing. He was strikingly beautiful. Cassius Dio and Suetonius both describe him as possessing feminine delicacy, the kind of youthful charm that made him vulnerable in a palace ruled by an emperor obsessed with appearances and theatrical illusions. Nero was in the midst of emotional ruin. His beloved wife, Poppaea Sabina, had died the previous year under circumstances that even his supporters found troubling. Ancient writers whisper that Nero himself, in a fit of rage, had struck her while she was pregnant. Whether true or not, the rumor clung to him. Grief, guilt, and political instability deepened his need to control his surroundings. He wanted comfort, admiration, and above all, he wanted to erase the memory of his own cruelty. It was in this fragile psychological state that Nero saw Sporus. The resemblance was uncanny. The boy's face, voice, and gentle manner reminded him of Poppaea. For Nero, this was not coincidence but opportunity. Rome had seen emperors take lovers before. Rome had seen emperors keep eunuchs before. But what Nero proposed had no precedent. He would not take Sporus as a simple slave or entertain him as a private diversion. He would transform him into a replacement for the woman whose loss haunted him. And so, with almost ritualistic coldness, Nero ordered the irreversible act that would seal Sporus's fate. He was castrated, reshaped to embody Nero's fantasy, and prepared to become something Rome had never seen before, an emperor's living doll. To understand the magnitude of this, one must understand Rome's political theater. The imperial household was a stage. Every gesture, costume, and ceremony conveyed power. Nero lived for performance. He saw himself not only as emperor, but as musician, charioteer, actor. When he looked at Sporus, he saw the possibility of resurrecting the role that Poppaea had once played at his side. He wanted the empire to witness it. Months after Sporus's mutilation, Nero staged a public wedding. The emperor himself took the role of groom. Sporus, heavily adorned in the attire of an imperial bride, stepped into the role of empress. The Roman elite watched in stunned silence as the emperor placed a veil over the boy's head and led him through the traditional rites of marriage, complete with dowry and witnessed vows. The audacity of the event sent shockwaves through the city. The Praetorian Guard, senators, and foreign envoys could only pretend that what they had seen was legitimate, and yet there was little they could do. Nero's power was absolute, and his appetite for theatrical dominance made him unassailable. The wedding was not about love. It was about control, identity, and spectacle. Sporus became a symbol of Nero's defiance against Roman norms. The emperor wanted to demonstrate that he could recreate the world in his image and that no law, custom, or moral principle could restrain him. But beneath the spectacle was a darker truth. For Sporus, the ceremony marked the beginning of a life lived under constant surveillance. He never spoke publicly. His thoughts, fears, and dreams remain unrecorded by history because Rome never saw him as a person. He was instead referenced as an ornament, a possession, a role Nero used to distract himself from political turmoil. In AD 65 and AD 66, while conspiracies formed against the emperor, Sporus accompanied Nero in public events. Seated beside him in litters, accompanied by bodyguards, treated as if he were Poppaea resurrected. The psychological torment of such a life can only be imagined. Sporus was forced to inhabit the identity of a dead woman, to participate in rituals he never chose, to smile when commanded, to walk when signaled, to live surrounded by the people who had once served the woman he was made to imitate. Meanwhile, Rome spiraled further into chaos. Grain shortages, provincial revolts, and the rising power of rival generals weakened Nero's grip on the empire. In AD 68, when Galba's rebellion gained momentum, Nero fled the city with a small group of loyal attendants. Sporus was among them. Tacitus describes this final chapter as frantic and desperate. Nero oscillated between fear and grandiosity, at one point fantasizing that he would escape to Alexandria and perform as a singer for the Greek crowds. Sporus, always silent in the texts, appears at his side, a reminder of the strange emotional world Nero had built for himself. When Nero realized that the Senate had declared him a public enemy, he broke. The emperor who once commanded armies and dictated the fate of millions could not bring himself to face public humiliation. Knowing he would be arrested and executed, Nero chose suicide. His final words, as recorded by Suetonius, were lamentations about the loss of his artistic legacy, not remorse for his crimes. The last person said to have comforted him was Sporus. When Nero died, Sporus was left in a world where his identity had again been ripped away. A living symbol of Nero's decadence, he immediately became a prize for other men seeking to echo the emperor's dominance. Nero's death ended one chapter of Sporus's life, but the tragedy was far from over. The boy who never chose his fate was about to be thrust into another emperor's court, where his past would be used against him once more. The fall of Nero did not bring Sporus freedom. It only shifted the hands of those who sought to control him. When Nero's body was carried away from the villa where he had taken his own life in June of AD 68, the world he had built collapsed instantly. His statues were toppled, his inscriptions defaced, his memory denounced. But among the handful of loyal attendants left standing in the shadow of Rome's most infamous emperor, one figure lingered in a strange limbo: Sporus. For years he had been forced to live as Nero's imitation bride, the living reminder of Poppaea Sabina and the symbol of Nero's defiance against Roman norms. But now, with the emperor dead, Sporus once again became an object to be seized. He might have hoped for obscurity, even freedom, but the political chaos unfolding in Rome would ensure he remained trapped in roles written by others. The empire had entered what would be known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Nero's death created a power vacuum that men like Galba, Otho, and Vitellius rushed to fill. Each contender needed symbols to legitimize their reign, and each knew that controlling the remnants of Nero's household could be a powerful tool. Sporus, tragically, was one of those remnants. He was proof of Nero's excesses, but also a curiosity that could be displayed for political intimidation or theatrical purposes. He was no longer the boy, empress of one man. He was now a bargaining chip in the violent chessboard of Roman succession. Galba, the first claimant to succeed Nero, showed no personal interest in Sporus, focusing instead on eliminating Nero's allies. But he did not last long. Within months, Otho, a man with a complicated history of his own, overthrew him. And it was Otho who first pulled Sporus back into imperial orbit. The connection was bizarrely ironic. Otho had once been married to Poppaea Sabina before Nero had taken her for himself. To Otho, Sporus was not merely a relic of Nero's madness. He was a living embodiment of the woman he had lost to the former emperor. Seeing the boy beside Nero during public events must have left an imprint. Now that he held power, Otho placed Sporus under his protection. Whether this was driven by nostalgia, sentiment, or politics remains unknown. Ancient sources merely say Otho treated Sporus with unusual kindness, offering him a degree of safety he had not enjoyed since Nero's final days. But Otho's reign was brief. After only a few months, he was defeated by Vitellius in a violent clash that left the empire reeling. With Otho gone, Sporus again found himself at the mercy of a new emperor, one whose reputation stood at the opposite extreme. Vitellius was known for cruelty masked by indulgence, a man who loved spectacles of humiliation and theatrical displays as tools for reinforcing his authority. His court was loud, drunken, chaotic. And into this environment Sporus was dragged, a silent, fragile figure who now represented both the humiliations of the previous emperor and the vulnerability that Vitellius enjoyed exploiting. It was during Vitellius's reign that Sporus's tragedy reached its darkest turning point. According to Suetonius, Vitellius devised a grotesque idea. He wished to reenact the myth of Proserpina, the goddess abducted by Pluto and taken into the underworld. But instead of staging the story with actors or aristocratic women, he intended to use Sporus. The boy, who had already been forced to impersonate a dead empress, was now to be humiliated before the empire as a mythological victim in a public spectacle. Vitellius planned to dress Sporus as Proserpina and parade him into the amphitheatre, where jeering crowds would watch as he was symbolically violated in the performance. It was not art. It was punishment meant to degrade Nero's memory and break the last vestige of the boy's dignity. For Sporus, who had survived castration, forced marriage, and years of objectification, this was the final step into complete degradation. When he learned what Vitellius intended to do with him, something inside him broke. Ancient historians record his decision with tragic brevity. Faced with a future of public humiliation that would erase every shred of autonomy he had left, Sporus chose death. He took his own life, ending a story of suffering that Rome had witnessed but never cared to prevent. His suicide took place sometime in AD 69. He was still very young, likely only in his late teens or early 20s. And yet, in the short span of his life, he had been reshaped by 3 emperors, paraded as a symbol, used as a tool for political theater, and denied the basic humanity that history often grants even the most obscure figures. His existence had been a tragedy of power, a demonstration of what could happen when absolute authority collided with a vulnerable life. But Sporus's death did not erase the questions his life raised. Rome, an empire known for legalism and rigid hierarchies, rarely confronted the moral implications of what had been done to him. Instead, he became a footnote in the biographies of emperors. For centuries, he was remembered only as Nero's living doll, a strange anecdote in the chronicles of imperial decadence. But modern historians have returned to his story with deeper interest, seeing in it a reflection of Roman attitudes toward gender, sexuality, and power. To some scholars, Sporus was a victim of Nero's psychological decline, the emperor's attempt to reconstruct his lost wife through a living proxy. To others, Sporus represents the extremes of Roman imperial authority, where the body of a slave could be molded into a symbol without regard for personal identity. In a society where eunuchs were often considered useful servants, and where the boundaries of gender expression could be stretched for the sake of performance, Sporus became the ultimate example of how far the empire could go in blurring lines between personhood and objecthood. The political consequences of his story also reverberate through historical analysis. Nero's treatment of Sporus became part of the evidence used by ancient writers to condemn the emperor's moral corruption. Vitellius's plan to use Sporus in a public spectacle was cited as proof of his cruelty. Even Otho's brief protection of the boy is mentioned as a rare moment of humanity amid the chaos of succession. Thus, Sporus's life indirectly shaped the reputations of the men who ruled him. Each emperor's treatment of him became a note in the moral ledger historians used to evaluate their character. But the question modern scholars often ask is this: who was Sporus, really? We know nothing of his family, his birthplace, or the language he spoke. We know nothing about his dreams, his personality, his talents. We know only how others chose to use him, and perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of all. A life shaped entirely by the desires and whims of the powerful, a human being remembered only through the instruments of those who harmed him. Still, even in the silence of historical records, Sporus's story forces us to confront the darker side of Rome's grandeur. It exposes the cracks in the empire's moral foundation, the willingness of rulers to sacrifice the innocence of individuals to maintain illusions of power. His life is a lens through which we can see the cost of unchecked authority, the vulnerability of those trapped within imperial households, and the haunting truth that even the mightiest empires rest on the suffering of the unseen. Sporus's death brought an end to his personal torment, but his story continued to echo through the centuries. The court of Nero, the theatrical excesses, the humiliation staged by Vitellius, and the brief protection under Otho all paint a picture of Rome at its most unstable and morally fragmented. And within that picture stands Sporus, silent yet unforgettable, a reminder of the human cost behind imperial spectacle. The death of Sporus in AD 69 should have marked the quiet end of a life spent in the shadows of emperors, but instead, his memory lingered in the political imagination of Rome long after he was gone. His story refused to fade. It lived in whispers, in court gossip, in speeches meant to mock tyrants, and in the writings of historians who sought to explain why the empire had spiraled into chaos. To understand how Sporus's life became a lasting symbol, we must look deeper into Rome's complex social systems and the ways his existence exposed the empire's contradictions. The tragedy of Sporus was not only a personal one, it was a reflection of a world where power shaped identity, where the boundaries of gender, honor, and humanity were bent to serve political ambition. In this wider context, Sporus becomes more than a victim of Nero. He becomes a lens through which we examine the tensions of the Roman world itself. To appreciate this larger impact, we must first understand the institution that made Sporus's story possible, the Roman imperial household. In Rome, the imperial palace was not merely a residence. It was the heart of power. It contained administrators, guards, scribes, physicians, cooks, performers, and slaves of every rank. Many palace slaves held more power than freeborn citizens, yet they had no legal autonomy. They were property, tools in the hands of emperors, their identities shaped by the shifting politics of the court. Eunuchs were especially valued. In many parts of the ancient world, from the courts of the Parthians to the kingdoms of the East, eunuchs were considered ideal servants because they were loyal, unable to form dynastic ambitions, and often viewed as physically safe to place among women of the household. Rome imported some of these ideas, though with a moral discomfort that never fully faded. Within this system, Sporus's castration was not an isolated act, but part of a broader pattern of exploitation. Yet his case was extreme. He was not castrated for service, but to fulfill an emotional fantasy. He was not used to protect the imperial lineage, but to recreate a lost woman. His role was not practical, but theatrical. This distinction is what made his story so disturbing to Roman writers, and why it endured long after similar abuses were forgotten. Roman society had strict ideas about gender and reputation. Masculinity was tied to autonomy, civic status, and the ability to control one's own body. Femininity, in Roman eyes, was associated with submission, beauty, and domestic roles. When Nero forced Sporus into a feminine identity, he disrupted these expectations. The public wedding, complete with veils, dowry, and ceremonial robes, challenged the Roman notion of what an emperor should represent. Many Romans did not object on moral grounds alone. They objected because Nero's actions blurred the lines of dignity and hierarchy that defined their world. But beneath these social debates lies something more important. Sporus's experience reveals the fragility of personal identity in an empire built on dominance. For emperors, identity was performance. Nero's theatrical persona shaped his rule. Otho's association with Poppaea influenced his public image. Vitellius's brutality defined his legacy, Sporus became a silent participant in these performances. His presence added emotional weight to Nero's grief-driven theatrics, a sense of nostalgia to Otho's brief rule, and a cruel prop for Vitellius's planned spectacle. Yet in each case, Sporus also became a symbol of what each emperor lacked. Nero, despite his power, lacked emotional stability. Otho, despite his discipline, lacked lasting control. Vitellius, despite his authority, lacked restraint. Sporus, in the minds of ancient writers, became a haunting reminder of the weaknesses of the men who ruled him. This symbolic afterlife transformed him into a recurring figure in the histories of the era. But Sporus's importance reached beyond symbolism. His life helps modern historians better understand how Roman society viewed gender fluidity and forced transformations. While the Romans had rigid gender expectations, they also existed in a world where performers, religious rituals, and slaves often crossed these boundaries. Actors on stage played both male and female roles. Priests of the goddess Cybele practiced ritual castration and adopted feminine clothing and behaviors. Young boys with soft voices were sometimes trained for singing or performance. In this cultural landscape, Sporus's forced feminization was shocking, but not entirely alien to Roman imagination. What made it monstrous was the combination of imperial authority and personal exploitation. In unpacking this complexity, modern historians ask important questions. Did Sporus have a sense of identity before Nero found him? Did he understand what was being done to him, or was he too young to fully grasp the consequences? Was he treated with tenderness behind closed doors, or only as an object for display? And did he ever try to resist, or had years of control made resistance impossible? These questions have no definitive answers, because ancient sources wrote about Sporus from the perspective of emperors, not from the perspective of a boy stripped of agency. The silence surrounding his inner world is a reminder of how history often forgets the powerless. Still, his life had real political implications. The story of Sporus was later used by critics of the empire to attack Nero's memory. Writers like Cassius Dio and Suetonius cited the marriage to Sporus as evidence of Nero's instability and moral corruption. This narrative helped frame Nero as a symbol of decline, contributing to the political justification for reforms under later emperors. Sporus, in death, became part of the argument for moral restoration and stronger leadership. Even after his death, Sporus's name surfaced in political jokes, satirical speeches, and whispered anecdotes. Some senators mocked rivals by comparing them to Sporus, calling them soft or accusing them of submitting to the whims of powerful men. The name Sporus became shorthand for someone forced into humiliation, an insult loaded with assumptions about masculinity and weakness. This was unfair, of course, because Sporus had never chosen his fate. But the cruelty of Roman humor often mirrored the cruelty of Roman politics. The psychological dimension of his story also forces us to reflect on the nature of trauma in ancient societies. The Romans rarely spoke of psychological suffering, yet their literature is filled with stories of manipulated lives, forced identities, and people trapped in roles they could not escape. Sporus stands among these figures, one whose body and identity were reshaped through violence. The trauma he endured likely shaped every moment of his short life, though the ancient world lacked the language to describe it. The tragedy of Sporus also sheds light on the role of performance in the imperial court. For Nero, performance was not a pastime, it was a philosophy of rule. He saw himself as a god of the stage and the world as his audience. By forcing Sporus into Poppaea's role, Nero blurred the line between drama and governance. He believed he could rewrite reality through gesture, costume, and ceremony. The wedding to Sporus was not meant to shock. It was meant to assert control, to tell the world that Nero could defy convention itself. But the empire was changing. The political turmoil of AD 68 and 69 showed that emperors could no longer rule by theatricality alone. Military power and senatorial support had become essential. In this new landscape, Sporus's tragic existence became a cautionary tale. It reminded Rome that the whims of tyrants could lead to instability, humiliation, and rebellion. The story of Sporus endures because it forces us to confront the darker side of imperial majesty. Behind the military victories, the marble monuments, and the golden displays lay the lives of those who were crushed to maintain the illusion of power. Sporus was not a political leader, not a general, not a rebel. He was a boy whose existence intersected with the ambitions of emperors. And yet, in his silence, he reveals more about the cruelty of Rome's golden age than many generals or senators ever could. In the centuries that followed Sporus's death, Rome's political landscape shifted, emperors rose and fell, and the empire itself transformed into something vastly different from the world Sporus knew. Yet his story did not disappear. It resurfaced again and again, woven into the writings of Rome's chroniclers and retold as a symbol of imperial excess. Even though Sporus left behind no diary, no inscription, no personal testimony, his life became a fragment of Rome's collective memory. His suffering outlived the men who controlled him, and in that afterlife, Sporus achieved a strange kind of immortality. To understand this enduring impact, we must trace how later generations interpreted his life, and what his story reveals about the deeper forces that shaped Roman society and the long arc of human history. In the first generations after Sporus, historians such as Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio began shaping the narrative of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. These writers were not neutral observers. They sought lessons, moral warnings, and dramatic structure. Nero became, in their hands, the archetype of a corrupt and destructive ruler, and Sporus became part of the evidence. When Suetonius described Nero's decision to castrate Sporus and marry him in a public ceremony, it was not merely to shock readers. It was to demonstrate the point at which power had decayed into madness. For these authors, Sporus was less a character than a dramatic symbol, one whose suffering illustrated the decline of imperial virtue. Yet, when read carefully, these accounts reveal something more. They show the limitations of Roman understanding. They saw Sporus primarily through the lens of morality and gender expectations. They described him with words that conveyed softness, delicacy, and submission, judging him not for who he was, but for what his forced role seemed to represent. They did not ask what Sporus felt, feared, or desired. They did not consider the possibility that he was traumatized, or that his actions were guided by survival rather than choice. In their writings, Sporus appears as a passive figure shaped entirely by the wills of Nero, Otho, and Vitellius. But even within these biased accounts, glimmers of truth remain. Suetonius notes that Nero called Sporus by Poppaea's name. Cassius Dio describes the wedding in vivid detail. Tacitus mentions the boy's presence during Nero's final flight. These fragments, though filtered through moral judgment, help modern historians reconstruct the reality of Sporus's world. They show us a life lived under constant pressure, a life in which the body itself became a political object. Over time, as the Roman Empire transitioned into the autocratic structures of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Sporus became a cautionary tale. Later writers invoked his name when criticizing emperors who displayed signs of extravagance or moral decline. When Commodus performed in the arena, some compared his theatrics to Nero's. When Elagabalus adopted unusual gender roles and staged controversial ceremonies, critics resurrected the example of Sporus to condemn him. Thus, Sporus became a point of comparison, a rhetorical tool that Roman authors used to discuss broader anxieties about authority, masculinity, and control. But the afterlife of Sporus's story extended far beyond ancient Rome. In later European scholarship, particularly during the Renaissance, interest in the lives of Roman emperors resurfaced. Humanist scholars returned to the works of Suetonius and Tacitus, fascinated by the extremes of Roman politics. In their retellings, Sporus again appeared as a symbol of Nero's cruelty. Yet attitudes toward gender had shifted significantly by then, and Sporus was viewed through a narrower lens of moral judgment. His forced feminization was interpreted by some as a sign of Rome's decadence, serving as a moral warning about the dangers of abandoning traditional virtues. It was not until the modern era that Sporus's story began to be reinterpreted with empathy. Historians, sociologists, and scholars of gender studies revisited his life with new questions. Instead of asking what Sporus represented to Nero, they asked what Rome represented to Sporus. This shift allowed his story to take on new meaning. Modern historians highlight several key themes in Sporus's life. One is the fragility of personal identity in systems of absolute power. Sporus had no legal autonomy. His body was reshaped, his name replaced, and his role dictated by men whose emotions and ambitions determined his fate. In this way, Sporus's life illustrates how authoritarian societies erase individuality. His story invites us to consider how many other lives were lost or reshaped in silence. Another theme is the historical treatment of gender nonconformity. Although Sporus's feminization was forced, his story opens a window into ancient perceptions of gender. It shows how fluidity existed in performance, ritual, and domestic roles, even while strict norms governed public life. Sporus has since become a point of discussion in debates about eunuchs in ancient societies, forced bodily modification, and the intersection of power and gender roles. Yet another theme is trauma. While ancient authors lacked psychological vocabulary, modern readers can recognize signs of psychological suffering in the accounts. Sporus lived through the death of an emperor, political revolution, public humiliation, and impending sexualized violence. His suicide under Vitellius becomes clearer when understood as the final act of a person deprived of agency for years. Modern scholars view him as a victim of prolonged trauma, one whose final choice was a desperate attempt to reclaim autonomy. But beyond academia, Sporus's story resonates with anyone trying to understand the cost of living in the shadow of power. His life demonstrates how individuals trapped in oppressive systems often disappear from history, except when they intersect with the lives of the powerful. Sporus becomes a reminder that historical narratives are shaped by those who write them, and that the voices of the vulnerable are often lost. Still, despite the darkness of his story, there is a quiet legacy in the way Sporus challenges modern readers. He reminds us that history is not only made of generals and rulers. It is also made of people who had no control over the events that defined them. By recognizing Sporus not as an ornament or symbol, but as a human being, we restore dignity to a life that was denied it. In this final reflection, his story becomes more than a tragedy. It becomes a testament to resilience. Though he lived in a world defined by domination, his story survived the collapse of the dynasty that exploited him. He outlived Nero in memory, not in life, and in that endurance we find a measure of justice. The emperors who ruled him are remembered for their cruelty and excess. Sporus is remembered for the suffering inflicted upon him. The contrast speaks to a deeper truth. Time judges power differently than people do. In the 21st century, Sporus has been studied in contexts ranging from Roman history to discussions of gender identity, human rights, and psychological trauma. He continues to spark debates about the ethics of historical interpretation. Should we pity him, honor him, or evaluate him as a symbol of something larger? Should we read his life as a cautionary tale, a window into ancient society, or an example of how individuals survive under tyranny? These debates prove that Sporus's story remains relevant because it speaks to universal questions about humanity. Sporus's life, though short, stretches across time. In the shadows of Nero's palace, in the cruelty of Vitellius's court, in the pages of Roman historians, in the manuscripts of medieval scholars, and in the classrooms of modern universities, Sporus stands as a reminder of the fragile boundary between power and vulnerability. Through him, we see the cost of unchecked authority, the impact of forced identity, and the resilience of memory. His story ends in tragedy, but its meaning endures. Sporus forces us to look at the past not only through the actions of rulers, but through the suffering of those they controlled. And in doing so, he helps us understand the true nature of history, not as a celebration of power, but as a record of what power does to the human soul.